This video is sponsored by World Anvil. How can you run games that are more like Critical Role? That's a topic I discuss all the time on this channel, and that also means different things to different people. What I think is essential to Critical Role campaign might not be what you find special about them. You might have different priorities. Like, maybe you think what makes Critical Role special is the incredible voice acting, or Matt's elaborate world building, or the very cool and elaborate maps and miniatures. But I think even if you didn't have all of that, the show would still be Critical Role. It would still be special. It would still feel like the kind of campaigns I like to run. Because at its heart, the games run on Critical Role have a core philosophy. The adventures are designed around the player characters to give them all a chance to shine, to explore their backstory, to challenge them emotionally, and to give them deeply personal yet still epic adventures. Kent, go ahead.
Kent Trimm, independent. So you're basically saying that unless we run our games the way you want, we're not running legitimate games of D&D.
I am not saying that, but okay, let's make sure we're on the same page. This is not the only way to play D&D. Matt Colville frequently talks about how, for his games, he prepares the adventure without any real consideration for how it will integrate into his players' backstories, outside of maybe using their past as a venue to funnel them towards the plot hooks he needs to send them towards the adventures he already wanted to run. There's also dungeon crawls where your players might have their own specific objectives, their own motivations that drive them towards adventure, and that might affect which specific adventures the players choose to go on if they have multiple options in front of them, but as far as the campaign narrative overall, that's determined by the Dungeon Master, without a whole lot of consideration about who the player characters are. That does not mean that these Dungeon Masters don't also care about their players, and don't choose adventures that they think their players would like. Like, if you're running a dungeon crawl campaign and you know you have players who love Greek mythology, you might pick dungeons that have a lot of monsters from Greek myth. If you know your players don't like the idea of sci-fi being mixed in with D&D, you might avoid dungeons that blend those two genres. Lots of game masters still run their games with their players in mind, choosing to run those adventures because they think their players will like them. But in a Critical Role style campaign, you might pick a dungeon because it's the best location for the players to fight the beholder that killed their parents. Matt Mercer's campaigns might have other things going on as well that aren't inspired by player backstories, wars and political conflicts and things that the players can choose to interact with or not, but a lot of the most beloved story arcs are generated by the decisions the players made in their backstory, during Session 0 or even earlier. In my last video I mentioned that these are the kinds of games I like to run. It's why I talk so much about that style of game on my channel. Not because I think it's the only way to run D&D, but because it's definitely my favorite. And so I was very pleasantly surprised when the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide basically agreed with me, and said that this is the ideal way to run a D&D campaign. So today I'm going to go through some of the new DMG's advice about how you can run a D&D campaign where the player characters remain the central focus. If you like this video and you want to see more insights where I talk about being a Dungeon Master, then subscribe to the channel. I try to make a lot of different DM advice videos, and if you like the style of game, you'll probably like a lot of my videos. And if there's a particular topic you want to see me talk about in a future video, let me know in the comments below. I would really appreciate it. Now, in Chapter 5 of the new Dungeon Master's Guide, the chapter on creating campaigns, there's a whole section about your campaign premise. And the first thing they talk about is your party, the player characters. That's how they want you to start thinking about your campaign, and I agree. The characters are the focus of every D&D adventure, and their players are your partners in developing their characters' epic journeys. By working with your players to understand what excites them most, you can craft stories they want to see their characters star in. You can also more effectively draw players into adventure plots if you understand what motivates both them and their characters. They talk more about drawing players into an adventure in another section of the book, and maybe we'll discuss that another time. We'll talk about plot hooks in some other video, but the next thing they suggest is that you get player input. And the two ways to get player input are either through direct input or indirect input. Direct input is just asking your players what kinds of things they want to see. Ask your players what they want to do in a campaign. Regularly inquire about how they think the campaign is going, what they'd like to experience more of, and what elements they'd like to explore further. After a session concludes and between sessions are great times to ask players for thoughts about the campaign. This is something that I've always been kind of bad about, but I've been trying to improve. When I started to feel the interest of my players waning in my in-person game, I went to my players and I asked them, what sorts of adventures do you want to see? What sorts of monsters do you want to fight? And I got back some very useful answers that really helped me figure out how to focus my campaign on what my players wanted. But this is much more focused on player interest, like we talked about a minute ago. Like, it's really useful for me to know that my players want to feel like they're making progress on the main storyline, or that one player really wants to dive into dungeons full of dangerous monsters and cool loot, but the rest of the players don't have as much interest in that. That's good to know, definitely. But it doesn't tell me a lot about how to put the focus on their characters. But it's something that I still try to do. I'm trying to I just started a new campaign, a Monster of the Week campaign, where I'm making a much more of an active effort to do stars and wishes. That's where after every session, you ask the players, hey, what did you like, and what do you want to see more of? It's helpful to frame the question that way, because if you just ask, what am I doing wrong? your players may not know how to answer that, or they might give you feedback in an unhelpful way, or they might not give you authentic feedback because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Asking which parts they enjoyed the most and what they want to see more of in the future gets them, I think much more useful answers out of them, which is why I'm going to be doing it a lot more in at least this next campaign and probably more of my other campaigns going forward, because I think it's more effective than what I have been doing. And then there's the section in the book about indirect input, where you can kind of infer what sorts of adventures your players want to go on based on just the basic choices your players made when they built their characters. Like, if they made a barbarian, they want combat. If they made a rogue, they want to sneak around. Those aren't mutually exclusive elements. Obviously, you can make a campaign that has a little bit of everything, but it helps you think about what you should prioritize. That's definitely true. It's useful to keep that in mind, but it is kind of just a starting point. We can definitely go deeper than that. I think it is perfectly valid to make your player characters a central consideration of your campaign just using that information. That data is really helpful. But also, I think it's a little bit surface level. It doesn't really get into how to tell the kinds of stories that I think are the most interesting. Thankfully, the next section is titled Character Arcs. Like most protagonists in film and literature, D&D adventurers face challenges and change through the experience of overcoming them. By incorporating each character's motivations into your adventures and setting higher stakes through play, you'll help characters grow in exciting ways. Okay, so the book is clearly telling us that we should structure adventures in such a way that they challenge our player characters on a personal level, because it will help them grow and experience character arcs. It's exactly what I think is so much fun about role-playing games, telling a story that is specifically tailored to your character so you could have the most heroic story possible. And I should clarify, this does not mean that you can't run pre-written campaigns. I take the same philosophy with me when I run Curse of Strahd. I still think of it as if it's a story that I'm telling where I know the main characters. As far as I'm concerned, anything in the module can be adapted, enhanced, or thrown out entirely to reorient it so the story feels as personal as possible to the player characters. I think that's why I have such a hard time reading pre-written adventures unless I know who the players are going to be, and especially who their characters are going to be. I talked about that a while ago on this channel, but I've always had a hard time reading published adventures. My eyes just glaze over. But if I know who I'm going to be running it for, and especially which characters they're going to be playing, it's a lot easier for me to read those adventures. I don't get lost in the same way. I don't get adrift. I really start to think about what it's going to be like. And rereading this section of this book and talking about it in this video, I finally realized exactly why that is. Because whenever I read an adventure, I'm constantly thinking about how I'm going to run it. But I just don't think I'm the kind of game master who just visualizes the ultimate D&D campaign with no consideration for who my player characters would be. I used to be. I would prep adventures or entire campaigns without really thinking about how my players would interact with them, or whether or not they would tie into the players' backstories or motivations or anything like that. But these days, I just have a lot more fun running the way I do now. And just in case anybody assumes it's because I'm copying Critical Role, that was already true about my games long before Critical Role premiered. I don't run games that way because I like Critical Role. I like Critical Role because I run games that way. So, as I'm reading through a published adventure, every decision I make about what's going to stay and what's going to get tossed and what needs to be changed is being made not just because of what I think is fun about D&D or what monsters I like or don't like, but specifically based on what I think is going to be fun for my party. And obviously the same goes for original adventures that I'm designing. Even when I'm writing adventures without knowing who I'm going to run it for, I still kind of try to visualize a party of player characters because I don't feel like I can imagine running an adventure until I know who I'm running it for. And it's funny, I always thought, well, it's because I'm just an experiential learner. I can't really imagine how this adventure would play until I can imagine the players in it. But as I was reading this section of the book and writing the script, I realized, no, this is why. It's because I want to run games focused on my player characters. But all of that is the why. Let's go back to the how. And here the book offers some insight. First, they tell you to think about character motivations, and it breaks them down into 3 general categories that tend to motivate each character: goals, ambitions, and quirks and whims. So let's review each example and show what it looks like when we can use that motivation as the foundation for a story. And the first motivation is deceptively simple. It's just goals. A character's goal is a short-term reason for the character to adventure. At the start of a campaign, this might be a desire for treasure, a thirst for excitement, or some need from a character's backstory. As characters continue to adventure, they'll find different goals to pursue, such as finding a lost relic, honoring an ancestor, avenging a fallen mentor, or defeating a villain. Okay, so this might seem really broad, like really unhelpfully broad. After all, isn't everything your players want to do basically just a goal? And mostly, yes. Now, I do think the next 2 categories are distinct enough to still be useful when designing adventures, but let's be honest, most of the time, if you're telling any kind of story, especially a collaborative story, at a gaming table designed to spotlight your player characters, you're going to be responding to their goals. For example, maybe one of your characters rolled for a random trinket, or some other way in their backstory they found a map to a hidden city said to contain an ancient treasure.
Jonathan?
Yes.
I think you found something.
Well, you could structure an adventure around going and trying to find that treasure. Maybe different characters will have different reasons to go on that quest based on their goals. A charlatan rogue might just be looking for wealth. A sage might be trying to prove that she is a capable scholar to effectively prove wrong the snarty society that snubbed her. A mercenary might just be going because he owes a debt to the other characters and because he wants to clear his debt and earn his freedom from them. But once they find the treasure, they've accomplished their goal. And obviously, there can be a lot of twists and turns in that story. They stumble upon a secret monster, they deal with traps and traitors and reversals and all the story structure stuff we talk about so often on this channel. You make the goal more complicated than just go there, get goal. But the point is, this is usually what we think of when we talk about structuring a campaign around a player character. Something the character wants to do that demands some sort of dramatic resolution. In the book's examples, it might simply be a desire for treasure or a thirst for excitement, and it's pretty easy to recruit those kinds of characters into an adventure. But their third category, a need from a character's backstory, well, that's the most dramatically interesting example they gave. This is when you make your character knowing that they're incomplete, that there is something they have not accomplished that they need to resolve.
I shouldn't be alive. Unless it was for a reason. I'm not crazy, Pepper. I just finally know what I have to do.
Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
You think you can control it?
No, not control it, but I don't know, maybe aim it.
Think about a goal, and think about what you can do to make it possible for them to find what they need. Whether it's something external, like resolving some conflict with an antagonist set up in their backstory, or something internal, like a lesson they need to learn, like maybe what they thought they wanted is not actually what they need. And then, as the book says, these characters might find themselves with new goals, which you can use as the foundation for new adventures. The book lists some examples of new goals, like finding a lost relic.
While the other relics often appear as stones, the ether is fluid and ever-changing.
Honoring an ancestor.
Dead for almost 20 years. Still taking me to school.
Avenging a fallen mentor.
They shot Nick Fury. And it won't end there.
Or even just defeating a villain. Now that's a fun example, because you can always just introduce a brand new villain with whatever levels of foreshadowing you want. From literal years of foreshadowing to literally no foreshadowing. And the players just have to deal with it because there's a new villain and they're causing trouble, and that's the story now.
Neil.
But I honestly love it when you can bring back a villain who was established in the characters' backstories and turn them into an antagonist of a brand new adventure. Of course, typically, if a villain had their origin in a player character's backstory to be the antagonist of a new adventure, you would actually want that player character to, be in that story in some way, to participate somehow. It would actually be very strange if you didn't do that. But anyway, those are goals. But what if your character doesn't have a clear, specific goal right now? Or you just want to mix it up a little bit and build an adventure around some other part of their characterization? Ambition. A character's ambition is a broad, personal aspiration the character hopes to achieve through a lifetime of adventuring. A character might dream of becoming a legendary knight or bringing peace to their homeland. Ambitions might be unrelated to the character's current goal. The reason this is distinct from a goal is that, as the book says, these can't just be accomplished with a single adventure, or a season of adventures, more on that in a minute. This doesn't mean that it's something that they don't think can be accomplished, or doesn't have a finite way to verify that they've done what they set out to do. Instead, the best way I can think of this is that this aspiration, this ideology, can inspire lots and lots of different adventures. For example, let's say your ambition was to save a corrupt city.
I'm going to show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt.
This is a very clear ambition, and it can inspire lots of different adventures. You present your players with untouchable criminals, and corrupt cops, and terrorists who want to drive the city mad, or madmen who want to make the city lose hope, or former allies in your fight to save the city who have now turned against your cause, or whatever Bane's whole deal was. But these villains are designed to essentially challenge the player character's ambition. If that's what you want to do, if you want to save Gotham from itself, then most of your villains will either be the typical obstacles you would expect to face, like gangsters and money launderers and whatever, or there'll be specific foes trying to undercut your mission. Also, before we move on from character motivations and using them as the basis for adventures, it's worth pointing out, you don't have to sit behind the GM screen with a notepad and pencil waiting for your players to do interesting things and monologue about what sorts of things drive them to go on an adventure. You can just ask them. Players often reveal their character's motivations through play. If you're uncertain or a character's motivations seem to have changed, it's okay to ask players for clarification. Once again, just talk to your players continues to be evergreen advice for new and old game masters alike. But there's one more method the book suggests that you could use for building a campaign that's focused on your player characters and who they actually are. Quirks and whims. Quirks and whims are a character's preferences, impulses, or other traits. They often emerge through play, such as a character's tendency to one-up a rude innkeeper, or their oft-expressed fondness for displacer beast fur. Maybe your player isn't playing the most complex character ever. Or maybe they are a complex character, but you just want to do a lore-light adventure this time, rather than diving into their backstory this time around. Well, pick up on some trait your character has and find some way to turn it against them. Is the character a noble who likes to be clean and proper and prissy all the time? Have them fight a bunch of mud elementals under the control of a black dragon, and in order to slay the dragon, the character has to get out of their comfort zone and plunge into a filthy bog or a grimy, rank city sewer. Maybe the character is a con man and a scoundrel, and everybody in the party and all the relevant NPCs know that they might sometimes pull shenanigans and they can't really be trusted to not prank them. Well, maybe that character starts seeing a monster that nobody else can see, and now they have to figure out how they can make everybody trust them when that's very difficult for them to do because of who they are and how they've been playing the game so far. This is the heart of episodic storytelling. This is exactly the kind of thing that TV writers have had to do for decades. When you're only doing 8-episode seasons every 4 years and all the episodes are extremely serialized, you don't have to worry about this. But when you have to do a new episode every week for 13 episodes or 22 episodes per year, then you'll be looking for any way you can tie your cool ideas into your characters' personalities, even tangentially. You can't burn through all of your characters' backstories with every single episode, or you'll be out of ideas by episode 8. So sometimes an episodic adventure can just be inspired by some quirk that one of the characters has.
Well, I kind of have this problem with, flying? Why do you think I drive everywhere, Sam?
If we're talking about TV characters who are driven by their quirks and their whims, I think Doctor Who is one of the best examples of that. The Doctor is a particularly impulsive character. He doesn't have any grand mission, he's not traveling across time and space looking for any particular bad guys or hunting down forgotten secrets that are going to drive a narrative forwards. He's just looking for a good time. Literally, that is his stated goal. He just likes to fly around the universe, looking at cool things, and he likes to bring a friend along with him because he has a lot more fun going on vacations with somebody else than going alone. That's it. It's really not usually more complicated than that. Sometimes he pretends like it is. He likes to act like he's going to be more responsible, that he's going to observe some sort of protocol, and that when something weird and dangerous happens, he's not going to stick around and ask a lot of questions and try to figure it out. But that's not true.
If you think that's going to be trouble, we could always get back inside and go somewhere else.
The entire reason the Doctor goes on adventures is to see cool stuff. And if that's one of your player characters, then the good news is that you do not have to work very hard to create adventures that will hook them. Just show them cool stuff and they'll be on board. But you can also take a look at some of their other quirks and build a specific adventure around one of those. Like, once again, the Doctor is impulsive and manic and quirky as heck. So what if they have to pretend to be a normal person and stay in one place for an extended period of time? That's a great premise for an adventure.
That was absolutely brilliant. Where did you learn to cook?
Paris, in the 18th century. No, hang on, that's not recent, is it? 17th? No. 20th. Sorry, I'm not used to doing them in the right order.
Has anyone ever told you that you're a bit weird?
They never really stop.
And here's the thing. Just because you're not diving deep into a character's backstory and you're doing an adventure inspired by their quirks or their whims, that doesn't mean you can't still have a really intense adventure. Just because it's lore light and doesn't involve the main storyline or really deep, rich backstory elements, that doesn't mean that the adventure can't still be intense. For example, maybe one of the party members is fascinated by the supernatural. Maybe, even though they respect the danger a monster poses and they clearly value human life and they don't want anybody to suffer, when they see, like, a werewolf, they can't help but stop and admire it. And maybe they're also really talkative and they love to hear themselves talk. They kind of figure things out by talking them through. Maybe that character is also the smartest person in the room and they kind of take some pride in that, and they tend to get very frustrated when other people act a little bit thick. Well, what if you took those fun quirks and you really challenged them and turned them into a vulnerability, a weakness that a monster could exploit?
The thing is, though, Doctor, you've been loving this.
Oh, Jethro, not you.
No, but ever since all the troubles started, you've been loving it.
I can't help it, because whatever's inside her is brand new, and that's fascinating.
What, the wiring? He went into that panel and opened up the wiring.
That was after.
But how did you know what to do?
Because I'm clever!
I see. And what are we then? Idiots?
That's not what I meant.
I can't really play very much from this episode because partially the BBC just does not fuck around when it comes to copyright, but also because it's just an incredible episode of TV. It's called Midnight, and even though I always say that my favorite episode is Vincent and the Doctor, if I'm being honest with myself, it's actually Midnight. It has an incredible ensemble cast, a crackling script that was actually written incredibly quickly, much more so than usual, but it's still maybe one of the best episodes ever produced of the show. It is a truly incredible bottle episode that feels like it was ripped right out of a classic Twilight Zone marathon. You need to go watch it right now, which you probably can't do because the seasons are not on HBO Max anymore, which is dumb as hell. But it's okay because they're coming back to streaming in a little bit less than a month on AMC Plus. It's frustrating, but that's a topic for another time, I guess. Now, so far we've discussed how you can build adventures around your character's motivations, but there's other ways you can use your characters as inspiration for the adventure. Family, friends, and foes. A character's origin, species, and background implies some amount of backstory, suggesting the character's family and what the character did before becoming an adventurer. Take note of specific background characters, friends, foes, family members, and others who might appear in the campaign. Should these background characters become important to the campaign, work with the player to develop them in detail. Revealing a character's lost sibling or childhood rival mid-campaign should be handled carefully to avoid straining credulity. Make sure a player is comfortable with new developments about their character before introducing them. Again, if you've watched any of the videos on my channel thus far, you already pretty much know how this one works. Your characters have friends and family from their own lives, and even though your adventures are all set out there in the wilderness as you plunge into dungeons, think about where those old characters are, what they're up to right now, and how they might re-enter the story and the narrative at interesting points. Maybe the rogue has a brother who's constantly screwing up and getting into trouble, and at some point, this brother shows up asking the party for help. Maybe your monk has a kindly old aunt at home that they send money to whenever they get a chance. And at some point, when the party is dealing with a particularly malevolent villain, that villain might go attack or abduct the old aunt, purely as a threat to the heroes to demonstrate their power and their willingness to go after your loved ones. Maybe your character has a foster son, but that son got kidnapped by a villain and murdered. Well, you could have that son get resurrected and come back using the former alter ego of that villain and trying to not only get revenge for their death, but also dismantle everything that they built in order to demonstrate that your ideology doesn't work. Although that might be a little bit too specific. That might not apply to every campaign, but if it does work, it could work really well. But essentially, this is just taking the material your players presented you with and using it against them, in the way they probably hoped you would when they made their characters. Because most players want you to incorporate their backstories and their loved ones into the adventure in some way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have created those details. When players do this, it's referred to as knife theory. There's a great recent video from MysticArts really talking about this idea a lot more, but the idea behind knife theory is to encourage players to give you elements of their character that you can use against them in dramatic ways. This is what the other side of that looks like when you're the game master. This is how it works when you receive the knives, I guess. Although I do think it's interesting that the book doesn't specifically say that you should weaponize these characters against your players by making them victims or villains of a new adventure. And I kind of wish they'd gone into that in a little bit more detail, because they're basically saying, don't forget that your characters in your player's backstory exist in the world, make the world feel more real by including them sometimes, and try to be conscious about not changing them too much. And that is good advice, especially the part about not changing them too much. At the risk of opening up a can of worms, one of the major criticisms of The Last Jedi is that Luke feels too different from the last time we saw him, and so some members of the audience didn't feel like they understood that change, and it took them out of the movie. That is, I think, the most charitable way to describe some of their reactions. And while I personally think that the Luke Skywalker stuff is the best part of that movie, I can absolutely understand why people don't enjoy seeing characters they're familiar with coming back in new ways without that much explanation. Well, I mean, maybe they forgot that it was explained in The Force Awakens, but the point is, we can set aside the Star Wars discourse for a moment. The point still stands. If you bring back a character, a supporting character in our case, from a backstory, and you bring it into the campaign, and they don't bear any resemblance to the character from the backstory, it's probably going to feel weird and maybe wrong for your player who created the character. I've been a player at a table and watched other characters roleplay with their characters' parents, who were NPCs run by the DM, and I realized that the parents were far more nice and understanding and compassionate than the player was expecting, because that wasn't how he'd created them in his backstory. And while I think the DM was trying to reinforce some themes of that character, that he was kind of his own worst enemy, that he'd been responsible for most of the conflict he felt with his loved ones, the parents were also just a lot more affectionate than made sense given the backstory. The DM hadn't captured an important aspect of these characters as the player had created them. So this is good advice. Think about how your characters were imagined, these NPCs were imagined by the players, and try to stay true to that, at least for their first appearance. Maybe you can change them later on, we'll talk about that in a second. However, I think this advice could also go further. Like, I would love to see it talk about how to use these characters. How often should they show up? How much should they change between appearances? Because, like I said, as far as I'm concerned, once they've come back once as the characters from the backstory, as the players imagine them, then every time they come back, they can start developing into their own distinct characters and changing based on what happened to them in previous appearances, or them getting off-screen, because I think that helps them feel more real. Yes, they shouldn't change too radically in between, but also sometimes they can. It can be fun to do a twist like that, and that shows the passage of time and shows that they're not just static characters waiting in place in the corner of the tavern like a video game character. How often should you take these characters out and use them as hostages and bargaining chips? That's another thing I really wish they'd get into. How often should you put them in danger to heighten the dramatic stakes? Because I don't think you should do that with every adventure, because I think it gets really old. Like, look, we're talking about superhero movies a lot. I like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films a lot. 2 of them are fantastic. One of them is, but it sucks that every adventure ends the same way. Mary Jane is held hostage by the villain. And regardless of how you feel about the damsel in distress trope and whether it can be ever done well or not, I think we can all agree that it's kind of boring when you do it 3 times in a row the exact same way. But once again, this is not a one-size-fits-all situation. I wish they went into a little bit more detail in the book, but you can't really answer how everyone should run exactly the same way because it depends on your group. Like, if we look at the media I grew up with and that I enjoy the most, I think supporting characters from your backstory should be regular recurring characters if they live with or near the heroes, but otherwise, they might just come back once per season. That's about how often we saw some of the recurring characters on a show like Burn Notice. Michael's screw-up brother Nate would pop up once per season, and sometimes he was in trouble and needed help, but sometimes he seemed to be getting his life together, and he wanted to help Michael, or he wanted something else from Michael. And you had a balance there where you weren't telling the same story with him over and over again. He might come back, he might have his life together, he might not, and there's a little bit of tension there where it still feels like the same character, but it also doesn't feel like he's frozen in amber. The same goes for a recurring antagonist, like on that show, Dead Larry. Great character name. He usually showed up something like once per season, caused a bunch of trouble, caused a new adventure to happen, and then he left. Firefly also had a few recurring antagonists show up more than once per season. In that season, Saffron showed up twice, Niska showed up twice, the Hands of Blue guys showed up twice, they would probably show up again if the show had gone longer. Even Badger, who was an antagonist in the pilot and a quest giver later in the season, showed up twice. So if you're looking at that show, recurring characters from the backstory should show up a lot more often. So when you're trying to figure out how frequently you should use these characters in your own games, think about the stories you enjoy and figure out how often supporting characters and old enemies should show up. Incorporate that into your own games based on the stories you enjoy. Now, returning to the Dungeon Master's Guide, the next suggestion is that you should run some character-centric adventures from time to time, doing kind of what we've been talking about in the video so far. Plunder your player characters for adventure prompts. Character-focused adventures. Adventures should occasionally highlight character motivations or elements of their backstory. Here are a few examples of character-focused adventures. A rival from a character's past shows up to settle a grudge.
And there's Jane, the money, and me. There was no way he was gonna drop that money.
A sneaky character puts their skills to the test by leading the rest of the party to conduct a heist.
I have a job for you.
A character learns the location of a magic item needed to save their hometown.
Miranda.
A spellcasting character must undertake a trial to join an exclusive group of spellcasters. I don't have a Firefly clip that demonstrates that one. Well, there was the time that Inara has to go take a physical so she can remain a registered companion in good standing, but that was actually used to write her out of an episode. It's kind of the exact opposite of what we're talking about right now. However, while we're talking about Firefly, I want to look at this next section of the book. Any adventure that focuses on a single character should incentivize the whole party to participate, even if just to help their companion. Avoid focusing adventures on one character too often, and look for opportunities to have character-focused adventures for each character from time to time. Again, you might be wondering just how often you should use character-centric adventures in your game, because they don't really tell you what the best practice would be. And once again, I think it's best to look at other stories, especially TV shows, and use those as an example of how frequently to incorporate character-centric episodes. After all, most episodic TV shows have a couple of episodes each season that really focus on one specific character, putting them in the spotlight. However, in this case, I don't think it's enough to just choose a TV show you like and use that as the model for your campaign. I think it's actually important to ask your players, what sorts of TV shows do they enjoy? How frequently do they want a show to focus on just one character, or at least use one character as a springboard for that adventure? How often do they want character-focused adventures in their D&D games? Like, I'm obviously a big fan of Firefly, and if you go through that first season, most of the episodes are inspired by one character's backstory or personality traits. I'm also a fan of Lost, where literally every episode was dedicated to somebody's past and how it informed their life on the island. And I'm a big fan of the Vox Machina campaign, where most story arcs were inspired by somebody's backstory. So from my perspective, whenever possible, I love to include adventures that are tied to specific characters, either dramatically or by actually involving characters and elements from their backstories, because those are the kinds of stories I enjoy the most. But your players might feel differently. They might answer something like Battlestar Galactica for their favorite shows, and you might watch that show, which you probably should. I remember it being pretty good, and you might say, okay, we get an episode dedicated to a specific character roughly every 3 episodes or so. I don't remember if that's exactly right, but you get my point. That is the rate that they enjoy having a spotlight shined on a character. Now, bear in mind that the more characters a show has, the more likely it is that everybody gets just one episode, and that every episode might be about somebody, if it's an ensemble cast. If there's a lead, like a really clear lead like Buffy, then she's gonna get like 10 episodes about her, and everyone else might get just one per season. But for our purposes, you kind of have to assume that there's not a main character, even though that's usually how TV shows work. But if you ignore the episodes that are hyper-focused on just the lead character, and look at episodes that highlight a supporting character, that might be a more useful metric for what we're talking about today. And I will talk more about character-centric episodes in another video. We'll dive a lot more into that. But another major factor is also the length of the season. The shorter a season is, the more likely it will be that every episode is dedicated to one of the characters, because they want to get through all the characters. It's part of why I can't give you a concrete answer on how frequently to run character-centric episodes, because it depends on not only what kinds of stories you and your players enjoy, but also the size of your group, and honestly how long you expect the campaign to go. But if you think of your campaign as a season, then I would definitely try to make sure that you fit one character-specific episode or adventure for each character during a season. It's a good way to share the love and make sure that everybody gets a chance to shine. Although speaking of the length of the season, I generally tend to break my D&D campaign into 4 seasons, because that tends to line up really well with the different tiers of play in D&D. Every 5 levels, the characters enter a new tier of play, and you can start using nastier monsters and raising the stakes for each adventure. The DMG kind of suggests something very similar in this next section. Setting new goals. Characters can change their goals whenever they please, but you can encourage them to do so by giving them significant victories roughly every 5 levels. When characters accomplish their goals, consider the following questions. How is this victory only part of what the character wants to achieve? Who might be upset by the character completing this goal? What is a reward the character will be excited to receive that also moves them closer to their ambition? Use the answers to these questions to develop new character goals and inspire further adventures. I love this so much. This section of the book really encourages you to think about the fact that a new storyline can spring out of what happened in the last one, which I think is so valuable for making sure your campaign adventures feel like they're all connected. For example, let's look at Batman again, because I just can't help myself. Whenever you're doing a new Batman movie, you could just have a new villain pop up. That's how they did it in the 90s, and it worked just fine. I mean, your mileage may vary about how much you enjoy the 90s Batman movies, but the point is, the audience accepted that sometimes a new villain just pops up. But what if instead you could establish the first Batman movie was a significant victory in the language of the DMG, but that victory opened the door to new goals, and those goals introduce a brand new adventure? Again, quoting from the book, let's look at the list of questions again. What is a reward the character will be excited to receive that also moves them closer to their ambition?
Maybe someday when Gotham no longer needs Batman, I'll see him again.
How is this victory only part of what the character wants to achieve?
The Narrows is lost. And we still haven't picked up Crane or half the inmates of Arkham that he freed.
We will. We can bring Gotham back.
How does completing this goal create a new challenge?
What about escalation?
Escalation.
We start carrying semi-automatics, they buy automatics. We start wearing Kevlar, they buy armor-piercing rounds. And you're wearing a mask, jumping off rooftops.
Who might be upset by the character completing this goal?
Take this guy. Armed robbery, double homicide, got a taste for the theatrical like you, leaves a calling card.
This is always the danger of any serialized story, like a D&D game. You want to give the characters some clear victories at the end of every story, but you don't want them to accomplish so much that they can just retire because the story isn't done yet. And this is why, as game masters, I think we can learn so much, not just from fiction, but specifically episodic fiction. Comic books, TV shows from before the days of streaming, and even superhero movies. There's a lot we could say about the MCU. There's a lot of problems about telling stories in a shared universe, and these days it's gotten a little bit messier. But when it's working well, it's because it got this formula right. Each installment feels like a standalone story, but each new installment still feels like it's piggybacking off of what happened in the one before. When it gets it wrong, it's because each individual installment doesn't feel like a strong enough victory. There's too much setup for future adventures, so this individual adventure just felt hollow. Additionally, some of the weakest moments in the MCU have been when a story had no consequences. Phase 2 has one of the worst examples of that. In Iron Man 3, a movie I enjoy, Tony retires and smashes all his armor. And then in Avengers 2, a movie that I, enjoy a little bit less, but I still like fine, he's running around in another suit of armor, and we don't get an explanation until Civil War, 2 movies later. Another rough one was Thor learning a lesson about how he doesn't need his hammer, and in the next movie, he gets another hammer. I still like Infinity War, but it makes for a very strange follow-up to Thor Ragnarok. They don't really feel like they're in conversation with each other. Because sometimes in the MCU, the consequences of a decision that the characters made were sacrificed. Those consequences didn't matter anymore because they wanted to justify a new story they wanted to tell. And that brings me to the last thing I want to talk about today, which is what this book has to say about exactly this topic, building on the character's actions. Sometimes it can be fun to let the players steer the campaign by having their character's actions dictate future adventures. For example, if the characters buy a tavern using the treasure they've amassed, you can adjust the campaign so that the tavern has a role in future adventures. One adventure might involve a competitor trying to put the character's tavern out of business. Another might use the tavern as the setting for a murder mystery. This is essentially saying that if your players do something big and dramatic and important, it should matter. Even if they think it might be sort of innocuous or just fun, like buying a tavern, that can still be a tool added to your toolkit. We in the biz call this story potential, and a major part of being a writer or a storyteller is just trying to recognize the story potential of any new elements of your story or your status quo. For example, let's look back at Batman. A lot of adaptations that start with him as this urban legend, something people don't even know is real, might have a caveat where the police know that he's real, but they don't approve of his methods. They are not working together. But then something changes. Maybe Batman saves the city, or his friendship with Gordon gets stronger, and as a result, we now get the bat signal.
Nice. Got a new toy, I see.
I figure it might come in handy.
He gave us the signal.
But of course, the bat signal also offers other story potential, like when other characters get their hands on it besides just Gordon. That's another story you can tell.
I saw the signal. That's not you?
I thought it was you.
You're a hard man to reach.
Commissioner.
Nope. Me. I got a problem.
Commissioner Gordon.
He's at home. I sent the signal.
The bat signal is not a beeper.
It can also be used to further complicate the characters' lives, like when they're in the middle of an unrelated mission or a dramatic scene, and the bat signal pulls their attention towards something more timely. It happened in the new Batman Adventures when Robin's search for Annie was cut short by the bat signal. It happened in the newest Batman movie when Bruce has to leave Alfred's hospital bedside because the bat signal went off. And of course, just like anything the heroes get their hands on, there's always a chance the villains will find some way to destroy it, or use it to manipulate the heroes, or just to subvert it in some way.
Where's that coming from? There!
Who the hell's doing that?
The Riddler.
Obviously, your players are more likely to get their hands on a tavern than they are to wind up with a bat signal, but hopefully showing you another example can demonstrate how you can look for the story potential from every choice your players make. And you can use that potential to generate new stories. Of course, if you're anything like me, sometimes it's difficult to remember what cool things your players have gotten their hands on, or what major story developments have taken place. It's hard to hold all of it in your head at any given time. Thankfully, it's easier than ever to keep track of everything in your game if you use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that you can use to create wiki-style articles for any aspects of your game. You can make pages for monsters and villains, or NPCs from your players' backstories, and you can record all the information your players give you, or that you've given your players, in these convenient and easy-to-read articles. Then, when your players do something that changes the story, or they get some important new asset, you can create an article for that as well. And with all these, you can also make notes that only you can see, like ideas for future stories, or developments that are happening off-screen before a character returns to the narrative. Because you can share your World Anvil page with your players and they can read about your world and navigate around the pages and remind themselves of story details that you've given them, but you can also hide secrets in the articles that they won't see, even if they're reading the same article as you. Additionally, if you're a storyteller working on writing prose, like novels or short stories, then you can do all of that through the website as well. They have a whole manuscript tab that you can use to write your stories, and as you're doing so, you can actually access all of the information about your world in a convenient toolkit that you can use to reference your world as you're writing. And if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. That's more than half off. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. So that's it. I just wanted to talk about this aspect of the Dungeon Master's Guide and share some insight into how I use a lot of these same practices to run my own games. And hopefully I helped you see how you can actually employ this advice in your own games with some additional examples besides just what they present in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So, at the end of this, does anybody have any last questions? Yeah, Kent, go ahead.
Kent Trimm, Independent. This is the second video of the year that has used lots of different Batman clips to illustrate your point. Is there any connection there?
No, it's just a coincidence. For this topic, I just thought Batman offered a lot of useful examples of these storytelling practices in action.
But this month you have tweeted about Batman more than 25 times.
That's also just a coincidence. We're getting some new news about the new Batman movie. It led to some trending topics about which Batman people prefer. I was just getting involved with those conversations.
Yet your HBO Max history shows that you've been watching Batman the Animated Series.
Well, that's just a great show.
And your Goodreads show that you've been reading Batman Black Mirror.
Great comic.
So you're saying this is not a new hyperfixation and you're not trying to transition to become a Batman YouTuber?
No, absolutely not.
Then can you explain your purchase history on Kindle, where you bought $100 worth of back issues of Detective Comics?
All right, no more questions. Nope, we're done. Nope, thank you.